Welcome to the Ticktective podcast, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Leah Gartner. This program offers insightful interviews with scientists, clinicians, patients, and other interesting people. We're a nonprofit foundation based in Silicon Valley, and thanks to a generous grant that covers 100% of our overhead, all of your donations go directly to our research and prevention programs. For more information about Lyme disease, please visit us at bayarealyme.org. Welcome, Lindsay Christensen, to the Ticktective podcast and video series.
Hi, Leah. Thanks for having me here. I'm really happy to be here.
Lindsay Christensen is the author of the book, The Lyme Disease 30-Day Meal Plan, Healthy Recipes and Lifestyle Tips to Ease Symptoms. She provides nutrition consulting services at the California Center for Functional Medicine and her private practice, Ascent to Health. Lindsay holds a Master of Science in Human Nutrition and is a certified nutrition specialist, licensed dietitian nutritionist, certified ketogenic nutrition specialist, and an ADAPT certified functional health coach. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you do in your day-to-day practice?
I'm a functional nutritionist, so obviously I work with clients on their nutrition care, but I've ended up in a fairly unique niche, which has partly landed me here, talking about taking care of patients with Lyme disease and helping them with their nutrition. So the ways in which I'm helping clients with their nutrition include helping them make nutrition adjustments so that they can alleviate certain symptoms related to Lyme disease. We're not only focusing on Lyme, oftentimes there are other things going on that we can also address through nutrition, like gut issues or blood sugar issues. But I usually start with clients by basically doing an audit of their diet, finding out where they're starting at, and using that in combination with their health history, certain lab results to put together a personalized nutrition plan for them that's going to help them in their recovery process, but also with all of their other health goals. So that that nutrition plan can include things like meal planning, the creation of recipes for clients, certain testing or supplement recommendations. I do incorporate a lot of the lifestyle piece as well because it's so difficult to separate that from nutrition. So it's a fairly general answer, but hopefully summarizes a bit of what I do.
And how did you get into this? I know you struggled with your own health journey.
Yep. So I really started to struggle with what at the time was a very mysterious chronic illness in my late teens. So hit kind of early. It took me about 5 years to get diagnosed with Lyme disease, even though I was living in the Midwest where, we know Lyme is fairly endemic at this point. Once I received that diagnosis of Lyme, then began the journey of trying to figure out how to treat it. Unfortunately, at least initially, I was very sensitive to just about everything, couldn't really tolerate antibiotic treatments, couldn't tolerate herbal treatments. And I ultimately found that optimizing my nutrition first, for me, in my case at least, helped me reduce inflammation and heal my gut a bit so that I could finally begin those medical treatments that I really needed. So that's how I got into the nutrition side of things, and then more specifically the nutrition and Lyme connection. So that's a little bit about my Lyme journey, and it's something I'm still, in the process of treating in some ways. I think there are ups and downs, but compared to where I was when I was 18 or even 24, where I'm at now is just light years different, improved. So I definitely had quite the experience with Lyme.
What percentage of patients who you work with notice a real shift in their health that they attribute to the dietary changes that you recommend?
I would say basically every client I work with does notice a difference. The magnitude of that difference, specifically as it relates to Lyme symptoms. Well, I guess I can think about a few clients recently who, gave me like a percentage rating of like where they were at before we started working together and where they were at, 4 or 5 months later. Sometimes we'll see, like a 50% improvement, just because nutrition can have such far-reaching effects. It's not just about nutrients. It can influence the foods you choose to eat or the foods you choose to avoid can impact things like your blood sugar control, which in turn can impact things like your energy level, how fatigued or energetic you are, how clear or foggy your brain is. We're even learning there are connections between food and blood sugar and joint inflammation and gut issues. So actually, I do quite a bit of work on blood sugar regulation with clients, and sometimes that the nutrition changes we make induce a substantial improvement through that. So yeah, I guess it's hard for me to put an exact number on it, but everybody notices a difference, and it also can depend on where they were coming from initially too. Somebody's starting at standard American diet and then transitions into the approach that I help put together for them, that magnitude of difference that they feel in their body and notice day to day can be, a complete 180. So it really seems to depend on the client.
Would you say there's more beneficial effect taking things out of the diet that are harmful and inflammatory, or adding in good and beneficial things to the diet?
I think both play a really significant role, but a lot of people tend to focus more on what they're removing than on what they're adding in. And I think many people underestimate the impact of the foods they are eating and adding in, the positive impact that can have. But, for example, if somebody's very gluten sensitive, they add in all the nutrient dense foods, all the anti-inflammatory foods, but they're still eating gluten, that could continue to be a deal breaker, for them, whereas somebody else who's not necessarily gluten sensitive, most likely I will still recommend they limit it in their diet at least. But, if that person's not quite as sensitive and we're really focusing on what I refer to as the displacement method. So we work on adding in foods, good foods to the point that it can start to displace some of those less desirable things like, the gluten containing bread and crackers and pasta. That method could induce a great change too. And that's, working more on adding things in. So I think it depends a lot on, what a person is predisposed to be sensitive to. And, because some of those sensitivities or allergies, celiac disease, of course, can really outweigh other factors in certain cases.
And what are some common nutrition mistakes that people make, especially in relationship to infections like Lyme disease?
Actually, one of the top mistakes I see is people not eating to support their blood sugar control. I had talked briefly about blood sugar a second ago. Blood sugar is not just something to focus on if you have type 2 diabetes. It's the way that our body provides energy to every cell, and it impacts so many different processes in our body. And I would say, more specifically for the Lyme patient, energy and brain fog / cognitive function can really be impacted by blood sugar. So some examples of what not eating for good blood sugar control would look like, that would appear with eating lots of refined carbohydrates, not eating enough protein. We need sufficient dietary protein to help balance our blood sugar, not eating enough dietary fiber. A lot of people are barely meeting what the RDA is for fiber, which admittedly is probably not the amount that's conducive to optimal health. So that would be a mistake that I commonly see. A second mistake I often see is where, kind of like we touched on briefly a second ago, where people are focusing more on what they're avoiding rather than on what they're including. And your immune system, which obviously we need to try to support that as best we can. Being Lyme patients, it requires so many different nutrients to function optimally. And I tell clients, those nutrients aren't coming out of the ether if we're not eating them or maybe supplementing with them. They're not there. And certain aspects of our immune function may be compromised. So nutrient dense foods, which are foods that pack a lot of nutrition, vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, relative to the calorie content of the food, can help support our intake of those nutrients that are going to support our immune function, not to mention many other things. So some examples of nutrient-dense foods, which may be controversial to some, but organ meats are one that I talk about a lot. So, beef liver, chicken liver, just from a nutrition science perspective, those foods contain a lot of nutrition. Seafood of all sorts, shellfish, fatty fish like salmon, crustaceans are super nutrient dense. And then many of our vegetables. So like the cruciferous veggies like broccoli, collards, kale. So those would be some good examples of nutrient dense foods that a lot of people are not eating enough of, if any. That focusing on and adding in in a targeted way can be really, really helpful.
How do you deal with the other side of the seafood and the fish and the liver, which is if you don't have super clean fish and super clean feed for the cows and whatnot, you're sort of bioconcentrating stuff?
Well, for example, with organ meats, if somebody's going to pick up liver from the grocery store and cook it at home, I really do think it's crucial that it come from a good source. If that's not, if somebody doesn't have access to grass-fed beef liver, for example, at the local grocery store, depending on their budget, it may make sense to do like liver capsules instead. We can get like dried liver in a capsule and take that. That's available, not that I recommend getting supplements on Amazon usually, but like just for example, it's on Amazon, so pretty accessible. But yeah, organ meats may concentrate some, contaminants that if they're coming from a conventionally raised animal that we don't want to be eating much of. Same goes for seafood. And unfortunately, farm seafood can really be contaminated with not just mercury, but like persistent organic pollutants. So I highly recommend wild caught in that case. I feel like that's pretty accessible. Like even Costco sells wild caught frozen salmon. I'm often helping clients strategize these things, like how to source these foods. Even canned wild salmon could be an option that's can be ordered again online. But quality really does matter there. And with cruciferous, cruciferous veggies, for example, or just vegetables in general, the good news there is that we can like prioritize using a resource like the Environmental Working Group's Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce that can help us prioritize which vegetables and also which fruits we may want to buy organic, and then which ones we don't necessarily need to buy organic because they're less likely to have issues with pesticide and herbicide residues. So definitely can take some planning and forethought. It's not always simple, but definitely doable.
Are you able to sort of frame the process of how you go about deciding people's dietary plans?
Well, I take a pretty detailed health history. Well, the client fills that out before we meet for their initial consult. I also have clients use a food tracking app called Chronometer for a few days before we meet so that I can actually see what they're eating, not just like in a written food log form, but actually quantitatively see what they're eating. And then of course we meet and I ask them a bunch of questions about their nutrition history, essentially, how previous dietary changes they've tried, what they're doing right now, what their health concerns and priorities are. And then I can start putting together the puzzle pieces of what aspects of their nutrition we may want to focus on first. And usually there's going to be, phases that we're going through, focusing on the highest priority changes first, like balancing blood sugar, for example, and maybe dialing in other things after that, like identifying food sensitivity, something along those lines. So it really involves a lot of question asking and listening on my part, identifying certain patterns, between symptoms and things that people are eating or not eating, and kind of put that together. And I also do find a lot of value in looking at people's labs, recent labs, blood work. They've done gut testing to look at their gut function or nutritional testing. That will all, of course, inform my recommendations too.
What do you think the mechanism is with Lyme and tick-borne infections that makes the dietary needs of those patients a little bit different perhaps than other patients, or are they the same as other people with chronic illness?
I think there's a lot of common ground between other chronic illnesses and Lyme, but also some more specific things too. Well, for example, with chronic Lyme disease, many of us who are dealing with that are also chronically inflamed. And diet has a really powerful influence on the state of inflammation in our bodies. And we know that from research on other chronic disease states and the impact of nutrition there. So another top priority nutrition wise for the Lyme patient is eating to minimize inflammation. So, that's a great place to start actually. But it would also be a great place for somebody with another chronic illness. I think some of the differences are that depending on how long a chronic Lyme, a patient with chronic Lyme has been sick, what I've noticed is that oftentimes the longer they've been struggling, maybe the more rounds of antibiotics they've had, the more stress their gut has gone through, they may be more likely to be sensitive to certain foods, more so than your average Joe on the street, like gluten or other refined carbohydrates, added sugars, and we may need to dial in their intake of those things a lot more than I would for somebody who's, maybe just dealing with a bit of indigestion and doesn't have chronic Lyme disease. And then, for clients with Lyme who are dealing with certain, specific symptoms like brain fog or joint pain, and it's pretty significant, that can sometimes be driven, or I should say exacerbated by food. So, we may need to try something a bit outside the box, like removing nightshades, for example, to help with arthritis, issues, or somebody's dealing with autoimmunity, doing something like the autoimmune protocol, which is a special nutritional approach, can be helpful. So yeah, some differences, some similarities.
And what do you think about sort of the 80-20, 90-10 rule where, people are sick, they're already miserable, and they don't want to give up some of their comfort foods?
I think flexibility is really important. Depending on a person's personality, a higher or lesser degree of flexibility may be best for them. So some people may do best with like that 80-20 approach. Others may do better with a tighter approach because it helps them control cravings. I think the key is to find an amount of flexibility that's going to work for you and help you stick with an overall wholesome way of eating over the long term, because it's really like the day in, day out things that we're doing with our food that are going to impact us the most, much more so than like a 30-day, reset and then going back into, your standard American diet.
Your book talks about a 30-day plan. So that's sort of a reset and then instructions on how to go from there.
I think a lot of people, it's helpful for them to wrap their mind around like a 30-day time frame. I mean, I implement 30-day resets with clients all the time, but we're also talking about what comes after that. It's not like we just screech to a halt at the end of the 30 days and, throw our hands up in the air and don't know what to do. We're always working on creating a plan for those next steps and making sure that longer term nutrition plan is going to feel sustainable.
What do you find is the hardest thing for clients?
I think one of the things people struggle with the most actually is like meal planning and preparation. It comes up very often in my conversations with clients where they're just struggling to consistently have healthy, nourishing food around. So we're often doing a lot of coaching actually around planning meals, having quick and easy options available for those days where you're feeling crappy and fatigued, don't want to like cook a recipe from scratch. And that is, a person can know all the right things to do nutritionally, but if they're getting stuck in a rut with meal planning and preparation, that can really, really be an obstacle. So that addressing that is really crucial. And
do you have any overarching advice for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah. So I know nutrition is not often something people think about initially, or even years into their Lyme journey. My overarching theme that I think about is, don't put off the nutritional piece. Doesn't mean you have to overhaul your diet necessarily, but don't ignore it. I think it's important to inform yourself about, the role that nutrition will play in your recovery process, and to do everything you can to nourish your body in a way that's going to support healing and hopefully not hinder healing. I do think sometimes you can eat in ways that may hinder certain aspects of our recovery. So don't put it off, make it a priority in your healing process.
Thank you, Lindsay Christensen, for joining us on the Ticktective podcast and video series.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Ticktective, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. For more information or to get involved, please visit bayarealyme.org.